see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here once again with Christian Keysers, who is a professor and group leader of the Social Brain Lab at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And the lab explores the biological nature and neuroscience of empathy. And Christian, you're also the author of The Empathic Brain, How the Discovery of Mirror Neurons Changes Our Understanding of Human Nature. And I'm holding up the book right now. I'm actually recording this with video and showing the book. And you and I actually did a kind of an extended interview going through chapter by chapter of the book. So anyone can kind of check the link here to kind of see that as well. And so Christian, you've done a new study titled, kind of the academic title is Psychopaths, Criminal and Empathy Reduce Spontaneous but Relatively Normal, Deliberate, Vicarious Representations in Psychopathy. And kind of some of the articles I've seen about it, they've had, kind of more easy to understand titles like Research Shows Psychopathic Criminals Do Not Lack Empathy but Fail to Use It Automatically, or Cold-Hearted Psychopaths Feel Empathy Too. So can you tell us about the study and maybe walk us through what the experience of a psychopath is as you see it?
Well, so we were really interested in trying to understand whether this common notion that psychopaths have no empathy at all is true. Part of why we wanted to know that is that if you think of Hollywood characters of psychopath, one of the things that you have in mind is somebody that can actually be socially very skillful and manipulative when they want to. So if you think of, say, Hannibal Lecter, at least, he's incredibly good with Clarice at really feeling what the fear she has and all her motivations. So somehow we figured the notion that they have no empathy at all just doesn't seem to cut it. So what we did was we used the kind of methods that I describe a bit more generally in my book as well, which allow us to use functional magnetic resonance imaging to really quantify empathy in the brain without needing to rely on things like self-report, which you might figure somebody that's in prison and trying to get out might be falsifying a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was we took them, we put them in the scanner, and we showed them interactions between two people. Now, in some cases, the interactions were painful. One person was twisting another's finger. Sometimes they were neutral, just touching. Sometimes they were positive as well, a gentle caress. And the first thing we did was really just to touch them and slap them themselves in the scanner. So by doing that, we could localize the brain regions that are normally active when these people themselves feel pain or a gentle caress. And we saw that these brain regions are not so different from the ones we had in the controls. Then we showed them others, like I was saying, interacting in these ways, and we zoomed into the brain activity of their own pain and touch centers. And what we then saw was that if you don't tell them anything and they just watch the movie, they actually have reduced empathic activity. So they don't activate their own pain as much as we would. They don't activate their own touch as much as we would while they see other people touching. So that was fitting this kind of notion that they have a broken empathy. But then, and that was very much the idea of my wife, Valeria, and we figured, let's show them again the same movies, but this time let's ask them to try and empathize. And what we saw was that the simple instruction was enough for them to lift their activity in their own pain centers and touch centers to a level that resembled that in the normals. So what that really showed us is that it's not the case that they have no empathy or no capacity for empathy, but that by default, this empathy seems to be turned off. But if they want to activate it, they can activate it and be as empathic as anybody else.
Okay. Do you have any idea why it's default turned off like that? Does that tell you anything, or you're just seeing that that's the way it is, but it doesn't tell you like why they're turning it off?
Well, so what we do know is that, of course, the switch that allows to turn empathy on and off by itself is not something completely strange. I mean, all of us have this capacity to regulate our empathy a bit up and down. So, for instance, if we face somebody that has been unfair to us, we automatically downregulate our empathy. If, on the other hand, we have somebody in front of us that's very close to us, we upregulate it. We also know that seeing, for instance, somebody of a different race receive a painful stimulation will cause less empathy than seeing somebody from the same race. So we all have this switch that can go on and off. So that is not surprising. Like you say, the fact that they have it kind of switched off by default is the real difference.
Hmm.
But there, we don't know yet what it is that seems to downregulate it by default. The one thing we do know is that the kind of callous, unemotional part of psychopathic individuals seems already to be observable in younger children. So now, when you look at conduct disorder children, there is a subcategory that is called callous unemotional that already has a bit this characteristic that you see later in psychopath, and that part seems to be to a certain degree inherited. So you can do these twin studies, for instance, and you see that if within an identical twin set, one of them has this callous unemotional trait, then the other one will have it as well to a large extent. Whereas if they're non-identical twin, the correspondence is smaller, which suggests that maybe what shifts this switch a bit to the unempathic mode by default could even be something relatively deeply biological.
Hmm. So, in a sense, you're saying that we all can downregulate or turn off or lower our level of empathy, and we kind of do that on an ongoing basis. It kind of goes up and down depending on the environment and who we're with, and that psychopaths have it turned off or downregulated, to quite to a high level, and that kind of could happen, have a biological root, and that you're seeing children already. There's some children who already have that state or that down regulation of empathy. Is that kind of?
Yes. So, of course, don't misunderstand me. Just the fact that it might have a biological or even genetic predisposition doesn't mean that we should just throw away the key and give up on these kids. I mean, if you know, there is a measure that is called heritability, which really kind of determines how much of the variance in a trait like this callous unemotionality is genetically determined. And this heritability index is not 100%. So it's not like the only thing that will determine if a person is empathic or callous unemotional is the biology. But we think that the biology kind of puts you at risk, if you wish, to become callous unemotional. And that if you have this risk, you probably need a particular environment to then not become callous and emotional. But what exactly we can do to kind of buffer this tendency and make them less downregulated spontaneously is something that we really don't know yet.
Well, this is so one thing it sounds like that you can do to upregulate is actually just request that the person try to empathize. I mean, you're saying that you're
Exactly.
saying, would you be willing to empathize with this person, give it a try, and it's actually having an effect. So I guess that would be one thing is that you're saying it's a nurture and
Nature and
nurture
nurture.
and
Yes.
nature combination, and that you're going in there with the nurture and saying, well, how about that, trying to empathize, and you're actually seeing that someone can upregulate their empathy. at that point.
Yes, absolutely. So there is to this finding, there's kind of the good news and there's the challenge. So I think the good news is really that I think nobody really suspected that such a simple instruction would boost the brain activity in the empathic brain of these individuals so strongly. So I think that's a really good news
Mm-hmm.
because, I mean, of course, it would be nice to see it replicated by somebody else to start with. But if it is really robust, it would give therapists at least something to work with. We would tell them, well, look, these kids or these adults actually have it in them to empathize. What we need to do is to make this capacity for empathy that right now they only activate when we ask them to or maybe when they want to, and make it automatic. Now, how we can make it automatic, though, that's kind of more the challenge. Where right now I wouldn't know what kind of therapy to use to make this really automatic. But it's important to realize why the automaticity is so important. And let us just imagine a scenario. So you're a psychopath. You see an attractive woman, and then there's two phases. In the first phase, you have to get this woman into a dark alley where nobody sees you. And then I leave the second phase up to your imagination. Now, during the first phase, you need to really try to understand how you're going to be able to lure this person into the dark alley. That's a moment where I think we would all be motivated to empathize with the person to try to understand how we can motivate her. But then once you are in the dark alley, what would keep you or me, I think, from doing anything to that person is that if we were to hurt her, we would feel the pain ourselves. Her distress would make us feel terrible. Whether we want or not, I mean, it's just our tendency. And that makes the whole idea, even of something like that, very repulsive to us. If the moment you're in the dark alley, you wouldn't have the tendency to be empathic automatically, now there would be nothing really left to make you feel so bad about this situation. And you might go on to act. So I think that the difference between having a capacity for empathy and being empathic by default
Mm.
is really the difference between having the capacity to be social when you want to and being a moral person that will always kind of be motivated against violence because the empathy is always there.
So what we really want to do is have people have empathy in the on switch, basically, or high levels on an ongoing
Exactly.
basis so that we act empathically. Because this really is fitting into something that I've been kind of thinking about and hearing about, especially in academia here in the United States, is that the idea is that empathy is neutral or empathy is bad because the psychopath can use empathy to, get into that dark alley. So empathy is seen as the negative in that scenario. That empathy is just is this neutral, capacity that can be used for good or bad, or that you can actually, like the used car salesman, can empathize with the person that they're going to sell a bad car to, and so therefore empathy can be bad. And I keep saying that what it is that there's not a widespread or a deep empathy that is the fault. It's not that empathy is the fault. It's that the empathy is like a positive quality, and that we need to expand the empathy. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think this is where I find these findings that we have kind of really interesting on a moral dimension as well. Is that what we see here is that there is an important distinction between the capacity for empathy that you can kind of use at will, and then the propensity to always empathize. So I think the capacity to empathize at will is really neutral.
Hmm.
That is something that you can use in your favor or no or not. I mean, that's really neutral. What is, I think, the foundation of a normal moral and ethical development is not just the capacity, but the propensity to be empathic by default. And I think if you are empathic by default, consistently and strongly, then I think you have a true pro-social motivation. Because at that point, if we take the example of the second-hand car salesman, if he only empathizes to understand how he's going to sell you that car, but once he gets to know, to basically have you spend more than you should on that car, stops empathy, then indeed it can be a bad thing. If, on the other hand, he's really bound by empathy and will be empathic even at the moment where he decides, should I now sell you this crap car or not? At that moment, being bound by empathy will, I think, make him pro-social, and that's really something that probably many people would agree with. That there is a fundamental difference between the capacity and the propensity, but I think that it hasn't been articulated enough explicitly in the literature yet. And I think that by doing our experiment, we ourselves realized how important this difference is.
Yeah, that really, that difference is almost like a crux of something that I'm seeing come up. I've, just interviewing people like Franz de Waal, and I just talked with Dan Batson, and they're both kind of seeing the empathy is that, in a sense, is that neutral quality. And for me, what it is, I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly here, but that the empathy is inherently positive in the sense that, when we resonate with someone, it has these positive qualities to it. That the problem happens is that when we turn off or limit our empathy, so the problem is not the empathy itself, it's the limitation of the empathy. Like the used car salesman is turning off their empathy at that point where they're not being honest with the person and not really fully, deeply empathizing with them.
Yeah, I think maybe the distinction is as well similar to the distinction between a trait and a state. So if you have empathy as a form of uh, as a way to get into the mind of somebody else, that's a skill, if you wish,
Mm-hmm.
that in a way I think is neutral. What you have on the other hand is kind of a real trait, differences, tonic differences in how empathic people are kind of all the time. And I think that those people that have a very kind of sustained empathy, where the empathy is always on, will be much less likely to do bad things to others because whatever bad they would do would bite them right back in the face. Whereas the people that have the capacity, but not this kind of tonic tendency to always have it on, those would be people that could actually, like some of our psychopaths are probably, become real con artists that use it when it suits them, but don't let it be the undertone of their moral conscience.
Hmm. Have you kind of put yourself into the shoes of a psychopath? I'm just wondering, what is the visceral experience of a psychopath? How are they seeing the world? Are they seeing the world as dangerous and nobody cares about me, so why should I care about others? Um, which kind of leads me to a question: is what would be the effect on a psychopath if they received like deep empathy themselves? I wonder about putting them in the scanner, empathizing deeply with them and seeing what the effect would be on them. So I'm just kind of wondering if you have you kind of put yourself into the shoes of the psychopath just to feel what it would be like to be in their shoes?
Well, so I've certainly tried. Unfortunately, I'll never know whether I succeeded or not. But I think if we're really honest with ourselves, I think that we all have moments uh, in our history. I mean, I certainly have had moments, for instance, where as a kid, I wasn't all that nice to another person in my class, for instance. And in these moments, you have this curious feeling that your empathy for a while really goes down because you somehow feel entitled. It's hard to say. You feel that in that moment you're in a way superior enough to the other person that you're not empathizing in that moment. Then of course you grow out of these moments and I certainly don't feel them so much anymore. But I think I have had moments where I wasn't empathic towards someone that was actually meriting my empathy. And when I try to put myself in the shoes of a psychopath, what I tried to do is kind of mentally hang on to those moments
Mm-hmm.
in which I wasn't empathic. I mean, an example: you walk out of the street and you see somebody kind of asking you for money, and kind of doing all she can, for instance, to really look miserable. You should be empathic. But you do have these moments where you just kind of figure maybe she's just kind of faking a bit to be so miserable so that I'll give her some money. And why doesn't she just kind of do something like bring newspapers to people instead? And I think in that moment, I feel like a psychopath myself. And I just think that maybe what the world is to a psychopath is a world in which he's just deeply convinced that all these other people are a bit faking to be distressed, that they're a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
that they're just kind of playing tricks a bit on him, and that he's entitled in a way just to not care so much about others.
Yeah, I've had that. I mean, I see that in conflict resolution. I've done conflict resolution. People are totally mad at each other. They're yelling at each other. They're pointing at each other. And they are just, and whatever they're saying, they feel hurt and they feel the other person's not listening and hearing them, and that they have a right to, demean the other person. And I've been in that
Yeah.
situation myself. And, recently too. So I know it from a visceral feeling. So in a sense, we are all kind of psychopaths in those moments.
Yes, and I think it's very good for us to actually remember that, because we don't want to be psychopath, but it is good to kind of remember that we all have the tendency to sometimes switch this switch on the off position as well. And maybe if we realize that, then we start to steer a bit against that and try to put it back on. So I think if an, if we accept a bit those states, I think we can enter a little bit into the mind of a psychopath. And then the question is really just how do we get out of those moments, and how could we help psychopath not get stuck in them as well?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm really looking at with the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, is how do we really raise the level of empathy throughout society, and to really create a whole worldwide environment that's supportive and nurturing of empathy. So I'm really grateful for the wonderful work you do, Christian. You've just done with your book. It's just, I really enjoyed your book, going chapter by chapter through it. And I learned so much about really the nuts and bolts of how empathy works. And I think your
Well,
work
thank
is
you.
really contributing to building a culture of empathy with that understanding that you're fostering.
Thank you.
So, well, okay, I know you're pretty busy. You had an article you were featured in the Spiegel, the German
Yes.
magazine. You've got this study out. You've been doing marathon interviews, so I know you're pretty busy. So I really appreciate you, taking this, as well as having a newborn baby and child. And so I know you're really busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat about this. So,
Well, you do wonderful work in terms of getting all the different pieces that the people add together. So I really felt compelled to help you with that.
okay, well, thank you so much, Christian. I hope we can connect again sometime soon.
That'd be nice. Bye
Okay,
bye.
bye.